On this video we're going to concentrate on the Lenningrad variation of the Dutch defence. A richer and more complex opening for black against 1d4 cannot be imagined. And on video 2 of this set I'll be going on to examine antidotes for black against all of white's anti-Dutch systems, thus providing you with a complete repertoire against 1d4. Now the Lenningrad Dutch is characterised by the early fianchetto of black's king bishop. It's a kind of turbocharged King's Indian, where black obviously exposes himself to some risk playing this way, but on the other hand he sets white tremendous problems. And so you invariably get an interesting game with it. Grandmaster Paul Motwani once remarked to me that he played the Dutch because he found it so interesting and rich. And it's in this spirit that we begin our investigation. Before you see the basic pawn position of the Lenningrad Dutch. Obviously we could put lots of pieces on the board, but I think I can illustrate the main ideas without them. Now as you can see, black would like to be able to play the move e7 to e5. In general this is a key move in the Lenningrad Dutch, and I would recommend as black that you look to play this move if it is at all possible at any stage. Now white, for his part, often tries to stop black from playing e7 to e5 comfortably. For instance, let's imagine that black plays e5 in this position and white doesn't take. Well, as you can see, if white doesn't take, black's got a nice share of the centre and his pawns are ready to advance at any stage. Maybe black plays e4. If we just put a white bishop on the board, you can see that will block out the bishop from play. Or he may, if we just put a white pawn on e4, it's perfectly possible that this pawn structure could arise. He may look to the move f4, which will give him kingside chances. It depends on what white does really, but by and large black gets his chances in the Lenningrad Dutch from playing a quick e7 to e5. Now just dropping the pawn back. This is why in many variations white goes to great lengths to play the move d4 to d5, which does two things. He tries to make it unattractive for black to free his position. This is the first point. For instance, let's put that bishop on g2 again. Black would like to nibble away at white's pawn by playing c6, but the fact is that opens up the game for white's bishop on g2, so you have to be very sure of yourself if you play such a move. And if we just put a black bishop on c8, if black were to go either e6 or more likely e5, then probably white's going to take en passant, and as you can see the bishop on g2 opens up again. So with the pawn structure like this, this looks as though it's going to be favourable to white, and black must choose the right moment to play e5. Returning to the basic position, I'm now going to show you what I consider to be a model game by black in the Lenningrad Dutch. And we'll see very early on that black goes to great lengths to establish a pawn on e5. I believe this is the key idea in the whole Lenningrad Dutch. Black must aim to establish a pawn on e5. The game we're going to look at is Farrago, a grandmaster from Hungary, versus a Finnish international master, Putainen. And this game was played in Budapest 1975. It doesn't matter that white played rather weakly. In fact, you'll look at the game and you think, well, white didn't play that weakly, did he? No, he didn't. He made a few small mistakes, but that was enough, and black's attack crashed home. The opening moves were as follows. White played d4, f5, g3, knight to f6, bishop g2, g6, and white played knight to f3. Now there are many other systems against the Lenningrad Dutch that white can play. We'll see them all on this tape, and I'll be giving you clear recommendations against each. But I should emphasise that this is by far the most common idea for white. Just simple development and the establishment of a two-pawn centre. Bishop g7, both sides castle. And now white stakes out in the centre with c4. And black plays d6. So there we see the pawn structure with the pieces on the board. Okay, Farrago played knight c3. And Putainen played knight to c6. Now there are other moves for black in this position. Namely c6. That's quite okay, nothing wrong with the move at all. And the modern move, queen to e8. A favourite of Mikhail Gurevich and Vladimir Melanyuk from the Ukraine. These two guys have made a career out of winning with queen e8. But there's an awful lot of theory to learn with queen e8, and some of the positions are a bit obscure, so I'm not going to recommend it to you. I'm going to recommend the far more direct and aggressive knight c6. And this is the move that Putainen played. And as you can see, it's a move which immediately prepares the advance e5. So it's very direct. And we'll see that if white doesn't play d5 in this position, then black equalises immediately and perhaps a bit more because of his presence in the centre. So for sure, d5 is the best move, and that's what Farrago played here. Now came knight to e5. Knight takes e5, d takes e5. And here we are, more or less the start of the middle game. Black has established a pawn on e5, albeit at a high cost, because as you can see, the pawn on d5 is a very strong pawn for white, and it becomes difficult for black. It's really difficult now to play c6. Black can't obviously do it immediately, or e6, especially e6 I think, because that's the move black would like to play to get rid of his weaknesses, but he can't play that just yet. So black has actually had to compromise his position in order to get a pawn on e5. Nevertheless, I think the pawn on e5 and the pawn on f5, these pawns really give black excellent middle game chances, and we're going to see just how dynamic black's position can be over the next few moves. Well, Farrago played e4. I mean, this is one of the main lines. It's quite a good move, but it requires sensitive handling by white, which, as we'll see, is not always forthcoming. And Putainen played f4. Again, this is the move I'll be recommending later on when we come to the theory section. I mean, that's a logical move, isn't it? It's more or less inviting white to take the pawn. That's actually a pawn sacrifice. White doesn't accept the pawn sacrifice in this game. Maybe he should. But as we'll see, black's resources are perfectly okay if white does take the pawn. But for the moment, black is establishing a bone in white's throat. White does not like the pawn there, threatening his king. Okay, so Farrago strikes out on the queen side. It's quite respectable. And g5. And with the centre locked, this is a perfectly respectable idea. White's operating on the queen side. Black must, after having the pawns doubled on e5 and e7, black must go for the kingside attack. Alright, well, white is afraid of this plan, stifling the bishop. So this explains his next move, rook e1. If black were ever to push those pawns up the board, then just bishop f1 and the bishop's still in the game, whereas black has actually blocked his own attack. And now Putainen played a funny move. He played a6, which at first sight looks completely illogical. I mean, you'd expect him to be pushing his kingside pawns, wouldn't you? But actually, it's a prophylactic move. Black is delaying white's attack in order to get on with his own attack. Black is preparing queen to e8, and then maybe, depending on where white's queen is, queen out to h5. Please remember that manoeuvre. It's a key idea in the Dutch. Alright, well, the Grandmaster continued making what he thought were flexible moves. And he played bishop to b2. And that looks very sensible. Can't fault that move at all, because it prepares to put pressure on the e5 pawn. You know, that move would make less sense if we just shunt the pawn across from e7 to d6, because, you know, the bishop's not even attacking a weak point. But here I think bishop b2 is a good move. And black played queen e8. That's the move we expected. Now Farrago plays rook to c1. And perhaps this is the first micro mistake, although it's not obvious that this move will be a mistake. Later it was discovered that perhaps c5 is a little better, preparing queen b3 and then some sort of attack on the queen side, maybe associated with d6 or c6. Okay, that was discovered later. But many people, including myself, would play rook c1 in this position. It looks very logical, preparing to push the pawns, but it's probably not the best. Well, black shouldn't play queen h5 immediately, obviously, because the exchange of queens is not in his favour at all. And he played knight to g4. And that certainly does prepare queen to h5. And Farrago saw that there was pressure looming against the f2 pawn. Because as you can see, the knight's trained on f2 immediately. Black's only got to play f takes g3, and then f2's under fire. So this explains his next move. He played rook to c2. And what could be more natural than that? Perhaps that's why he played rook c1 in the first place, to give him this defensive resource. Nevertheless, queen h5. White played h3. And now we're about to see how potent black's attacking formation can be. Because as you can see, black's got a lot of pieces on the king side now. He's attacking with his queen, his knight, the bishop on c8 is even included in the attack now that white's played h3. His rook's in the attack. He's got this pawn formation there, ready to assault the white king. It's time for action. And now came the key move in the whole game, which obviously white had missed. f3. And I think white probably got a shock at this point. Right, now if white were to play bishop h1 in this position, that's an awful move because h3 drops. Bishop f1 is an option, but then when the knight moves away, just a simple knight move away somewhere like knight h6, then h3 is under fire. And it doesn't take much imagination to sacrifice a piece in this position. Either bishop takes g4 or knight takes g4 is going to be curtains for white. I think bishop takes g4 is probably the best, but anyway, that's completely hopeless for white. And should white play king h2 in this position, then I think bishop takes h3 is a bone crusher. So this is a pawn sacrifice, a temporary pawn sacrifice by the way, which white has to accept. But having accepted it, of course, he lets the black queen in. So bishop takes f3 was forced. Queen takes h3. And suddenly white is probably lost in this position. Amazingly, after just one move. Okay, he tried queen to d3, protecting his bishop. But now Putainen played very attractively to finish white off. Knight takes f2 was the crushing first blow. Rook takes f2 was played. Okay, we should just see what happens after king takes f2, because it's very nice. King takes f2. Queen h2 check. King must come up to e3. And then a lovely checkmate coming up. Rook takes f3 check. King takes f3. g4 check. King e3. And then bishop h6. That's very beautiful. And of course the Grandmaster didn't want to enter into this particular variation. So it's perfectly understandable the rook takes f2 was played. But unfortunately black's attack is still too strong. Queen takes g3 check was played. And now if rook g2, then at the very least white has two hanging pieces on e1 and f3. So king f1 was played. Bishop went into h3 check. King went to e2. And now g4 concluded matters very quickly. White resigned. I think that's a very instructive miniature, and it gives you a clear indication of just how dangerous black's attack can be. Well, we're going to start our examination of the theoretical section by looking at the main line. Here's the basic position. We'll quickly move on to the second basic position. Knight f3, knight f6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, both sides castle, and white plays c4, black d6, knight c3, and then knight c6. And as I've said before, this prepares a direct move, e7 to e5. That's why I like it so much. Black is just being very direct at this point, no messing around. And now certainly the only move to give black any worries at all is d4 to d5. However, I feel we should look briefly at some alternatives to show how black's position unravels if white tries something else. Okay, several other moves have been tried. They haven't been very successful. For instance, white may play rook b1 in this position. Well, black could play e5 straight away if he wished. But in Garcia versus Haag, Havana 1962, first of all he played knight e4. And as you can see, that's quite a useful move. White would like to take that knight on e4, but then, after f takes e4, I think he's dropping his pawn on d4, which will lead to at least an equal game for black. So already, black has made that rook on b1 look rather daft, actually. Well, Garcia Haag continued. e3, e5, and black had painlessly achieved his critical move. Bishop g5 is a type of move which a lot of club players would try. I mean, it's just a move as far as I can see. It doesn't threaten anything, nor does it do very much. But it develops a piece, so people like to do that, don't they? However, knight e4 is a good reply, as played in the game Kuela Alexander, Amsterdam 1954. Well, that game went knight takes e4, f takes e4, knight d2, and now whichever way you capture on d4 you may take with the knight, or you could take with the bishop. Either way, black's got a fine game. b3 is another move which might be tried by positional players, just more or less opting out of the complications. And here black's got to be more on his guard than he has against other lines. The main reason being that if he tries e5 straight away, which is possible, then I think you give white too many chances. For instance, d takes e5, d takes e5, and now bishop to a3. I'm not saying this isn't playable for black, it is, and strong players have played this position for black, but I'm just saying that perhaps it would be more wise to try something else which doesn't allow white this possibility of bishop a3. And that is the move knight to e4, which is the same sort of thing as we've seen before. This time a move with more impact because of course white slightly weakened himself along the long diagonal. Well, bishop b2 has been played here, and now once again e5, hitting white in the centre. d takes e5, and now knight takes c3 is the best move. Bishop takes c3, and now the key idea. Careless black players will probably just capture on e5 without thinking about it. But I think the best move in this position is queen to e8. As you can see, white's e-pawn is pinned at the moment, and by this move black avoids the exchange of queens, which I think is important if you're playing full out for the win. The game Welsh Alexander, Cheltenham 1954, continued queen c2, d takes e5, queen b2, very positional, but now black got on with it. Queen e7, rook fd1, g5. And this advancing pawn front, in my opinion, gives black all the chances in this position. Finally, queen c2, which I think you'll agree is also a fairly plausible move in this position. Okay, fair enough, but I think a good response to queen c2 is just to get on with it again. e5. Why delay? In this particular line, it remains an open question whether white has managed to make use of queen c2 in any way. And in practice, white has been completely unable to make anything from this position. I don't think queen c2 troubles black at all. Returning to the main line position, we'll now consider the move d5. And now I'm recommending that black go knight e5, after which once again white has only one move to put any pressure on black, and that's to take the knight. knight takes knight, to try and enfeeble black's pawn structure. D takes e5. And in the upcoming middle game, black must fight tooth and nail to make something of his pawn centre. These pawns on e5 and f5 must give black some sort of dynamic advantage in the middle game, because if they don't, they're certainly going to be a liability as the game wears on and black doesn't prosecute any attack. So we'll be looking to black to attack in this position, and attack vigorously on the king side. White has two moves worth playing here. The first of these moves is e4, which we'll look at straight away. It's a very direct move, and against this I recommend the equally direct f4, which, as we've seen in the opening game Farrago versus Putainen, can be very, very dangerous should white allow black to reinforce this pawn with g6 to g5. Let's see some of these ideas. First we should look at the move c5, and white is trying to advance on the queen side, so this seems quite logical. And black plays g5. This reinforcing move is very important. And in the game Wells versus C. Hansen, Kurt Hansen, Grandmaster from Denmark, Peter Wells from England, Kiljava 1984, white tried queen b3, threatening to irritate black with a discovered check. And I believe the best way to handle queen b3 is just to park your king in the corner. King h8. I mean, it's a useful move anyway, nice and safe. And Wells played in this position knight b5. That is obviously not a very good move, so if we just retract that, I should say that black's plan in this position is basically a6 to maybe stop that knight from coming into b5, and then queen e8 to h5. So more or less whatever white plays, that is black's plan, and then a massive onslaught against the white king. It turns out that Wells's move, knight b5, just gives the black attack added impetus. Now actually a perfectly good move for black in this position is a6. I mean, that stands out a mile as far as I'm concerned. But Hansen decided to play c6 instead. Wells just went back with knight c3, so I think he's been a bit phased by this armada of pawns ready to set sail on the king side. And then black went queen e8. Already I think black is in an advantageous position. He's ready to begin his assault with queen h5, knight g4, and or bishop h3. Another perfectly plausible move for white here is b3. And indeed this was played in a game of Anatoly Karpov, when he was just young of course, in a junior tournament in 1968. Black played g5, and now probably the best move for white here is bishop to a3, after which black should proceed in the same way as before and then get on with the attack. But Karpov was afraid that black was just going to throttle him by playing g4 and f3, so he played f3 himself, and that's precisely the type of thing which your opponents are going to do when they're faced with your pawns advancing towards them. It's not a very good move. And we'll now look at this game Karpov versus Jakobsen for a little way to see how black builds up his attack. Jakobsen played queen d6. White played g4. Karpov was hoping to block things up on the king side, but now came h5, and it's starting to look very much like a King's Indian defence at this point. White played h3. Of course, black opens up the king side because he doesn't want the king side to get closed in any way, so h takes g4, f takes g4. Bishop went to d7. a4 was played, maybe threatening bishop a3. Queen b6 check came, king h2, and now black played a very good move, king f7, and with the idea of rook h8 went on to win in very aggressive style. A plan might be, well, in fact in this position black simply threatening to take on g4. We'll assume white defends against that. Well, doesn't take much imagination to double rooks up like this. It's easy to see how white could go down very quickly in this position, and that's in fact what he did. Another move to have been played in this position by grandmasters as well is a rather cowardly move, f3. I don't like it very much. I mean, black is advancing on the king side. White should be looking to make as few concessions as possible. Nevertheless, this was played in Hjartarson versus Plaskett, Hastings Premier, 1985-6, and it didn't turn out too well for white. Now, black could proceed along the lines of the last game by simply playing g5, and then maybe queen e8 and the usual stuff. But Plaskett played slightly unusually. He played c6. Perhaps he thought that the opportunity to develop his queen on the black squares, in particular the chance to give a check, was a gain for him. Okay, it was possible. Hjartarson took on c6 with the d-pawn. Black went check, queen b6 check, king went to h1. And now b takes c6 was played. And white continued to try and play this opening positionally by playing b3. g5 happened. Bishop a3, and the king went to f7 as before. Then came g takes f4. Now that might look anti-positional, but I think white was starting to get seriously worried about ideas like f takes g3, h takes g3, and then h5, with a very easy to play game for black. So the grandmaster decided to burn his bridges and take on f4, although it must be said that after g takes f4, g takes f4, good move this by Jim Plaskett, knight a4, queen c7, queen e1, black went rook to g8 and again obtained a strong attack, this time along the g-file. So I think you'll agree with me that black's chances seem very, very satisfactory indeed if he manages to get the move g5 in. And to close this section, we'll look at a very recent game between Peter Hein Nielsen, grandmaster from Denmark, and Heinrich Danielsen, another Danish grandmaster, played in the 1996 Danish Championship, where white tried b4. Well, against this, g5 was played, bishop b2, and now a slightly surprising move. Black played queen e8. Normally, of course, we'd be expecting to preface queen e8 with a6. But now suddenly a grandmaster goes and tries to do without a6. Of course, he's perfectly aware that knight b5 can be played. In fact, I think Danielsen had prepared a very interesting novelty. This queen e8 move is a very interesting novelty, and Nielsen refrained from knight b5. And I think I found out the reason why. Let me show you. If knight b5, white seems to be attacking two pawns. He's attacking c7 certainly, and e5 with the bishop. But now knight g4, I think, is a very strong move, with two variations. In the first line, white gets greedy. Knight takes c7. But after queen h5, he finds himself suddenly under tremendous pressure. The only move here is h3. And now, like Farrago before him, I think f3 is an incredibly strong move here. Well, what can white play? If he takes the knight, then bishop takes g4 is devastating. Bishop h1, rook f6, followed by mate along the h-file. This is very convincing. And if he leaves the knight on g4 and plays bishop h1, well, of course, h3 drops. If he takes the rook in the corner, then takes on g2, I think, is exceptionally strong. With a possible line: king takes g2, rook takes f2 check. Bang. End of game. The second line sees white playing h3 immediately. Well, now I think queen h5 is also a very strong move. with the idea that if white takes on g4, h takes g4, bishop takes g4, f3, and now f takes g3, with crushing threats. Well, a simple line would be rook e1 here, queen h2 check, king f1, and now black can choose between several devastating lines. Bishop h3 looks incredibly strong, rook takes f3, well, white's bust. So if it turns out that knight b5 can't be played, then queen e8 is actually a fantastic novelty, because black has done without the move a6 and saved himself a tempo. So back at the game, this may explain why Nielsen came up with rook e1. But as I say, I think black's gained considerably from not having to play a6. And Danielson went straight for the throat, knight to g4. Well, white could see the pressure looming on f2 and played f3. Knight takes h2. And this is precisely the type of attack that black is aiming for. Outright attack against the white king. Of course, if now king takes h2, then a check on h5 followed by a capture on g3 leads to complete carnage. So actually white has to leave the knight where it is, which is pretty miserable stuff. And by this stage I imagine that Nielsen was feeling pretty hacked off about his position. He played g4, and now came another sacrifice. Knight takes g4. This is really good stuff by black. F takes g, and now h5. A great move, because if g takes h5, then g4 leads to a very strong attack. Look at those two pawns coming down the board towards white's king, and queen takes h5 is in the offing. I assess this position as winning for black, so it's not surprising that Nielsen didn't allow it. After h5, he tried bishop f3, but black was not to be denied. He kicked off with queen d7, again putting the pressure on, so that if g takes h5, g4, with superior chances for black. White hastened to try and exchange the queens with queen a4, but black was having none of it. Queen to d6. And now it's all getting rather desperate for white. He tried g takes h5. g4 happened, and now king to f2. Well, clearly black has succeeded in his aim of detonating the kingside, and he went on to win this game with a fantastic attack in 39 moves. f4 is a pawn sacrifice, so we must see what happens if white accepts the sacrifice, which is obviously a critical line, with g takes f4. And in this position I'm going to recommend the move knight to h5. Now this is a typical theme in the Lenningrad Dutch. Black is trying to conquer the f4 square, and white can't just do nothing in this position. He can't just leave the pawn there and wait for it to get recaptured. For instance, if he plays some sort of neutral move like f3, and black is allowed to take on f4 with the pawn, then I think black becomes seriously better in this type of position, with an automatic kingside attack in the offing. So in practice, white has tried two moves from this position. Let's look at pawn takes pawn first. Obviously black responds bishop takes pawn. And once again you can see black's control of the central dark squares are holding his game together and giving him compensation for the pawn. And the move white must not allow now is knight to f4. If black achieves this position, then he has excellent compensation, with for instance a manoeuvre like queen d6 to f6 to h4 coming up. And this would surely be a winning attack. So the main line here is knight to e2. And after queen to d6, white is happy to play f4, returning the pawn, to try and gain the d4 square for his queen. Let me show you how black reaches the critical position. First of all, there are massive exchanges on f4. Black takes on f4 with the knight. Knight takes f4. White captures with the knight. Bishop takes f4. Rook takes f4. Or bishop takes. Takes. Bishop takes f4. Queen takes f4. And now white reveals his hand. He plays queen to d4, which was the point of re-sacrificing the pawn. And now I'm going to show you two good ways of playing this position for black. One of which leads to an equal game, one of which is more uncompromising, but at the same time more risky. Let's deal with the equalising method first. And this has only been very recently discovered in the game Delchev versus Zelic, Bled 1997. It's a completely new idea. And that idea starts off with the move e5, queen c5, and now the unlikely move b6. Well, this at first sight looks impossible. It seems as though, despite the fact that the white queen's been pushed off the dark square diagonal, he can play queen c6 here and subject black to very unpleasant pressure. But black has an amazing resource which has hitherto been overlooked here. He can actually sacrifice the rook on a8 even with check. Let's see how this all works out. After queen c6, by the way, taking on c7 was also possible, but that would give black the same attack, and this time white doesn't even get the rook. So queen c6 is best. Queen e3 check. King goes to h1, and now black sacrifices his rook with bishop to h3. Now, it's not really surprising that a concept like this wasn't discovered until very recently. I mean, not many people have the imagination to just sacrifice their rook like that. But I must stress that if you play this line, you can only expect to draw. However, it is a very safe line. On the other hand, we must now see how black gets the draw. Okay, in this position, white played queen takes a8 check, and the king went to g7. And now, as you can see, black is threatening perpetual check down the back, with capture on g2 followed by many checks with the queen. So white played bishop takes h3, queen takes h3, and it's fairly amazing in this position that white has no method of avoiding perpetual check here, because of, black's threats of queen f3 check and then numerous checks. So, white tried rook e1. This is probably the best chance. And now black has to play reasonably accurately. After that, queen h4 was played. A very strong move here. Let me just show you what happens after the mistake queen to f3 check, because I think that's a move that a lot of players will play. Queen f3 check is in fact not very good here. For instance, king to g1, queen to g4 check, king f2, queen to f4 check, king e2, and what will happen is white subjects himself to numerous checks, but the fact is his king is going to escape to the queen side and can escape via d1 and c1 to b1, and he escapes. So that's the type of thing which black must avoid. So we must return to the position with the king on h1 and the queen on h3, and that's why he plays queen h4, to try and drive the white rook to an inferior square. White went rook e2. Of course, the main idea behind all this is that white's queen can't get back into play. And now queen g4. Rather than perpetual check, it's perpetual attack against the rook. Rather interesting. Okay, well, in this position, white couldn't see any way of avoiding the perpetual against his rook, so he tried queen e8. But after queen takes e2, queen takes e5 check, king g8. This position is equal and was drawn shortly after. Returning to the previous position after queen d4, and assuming black wants to take a risk, then the move to play here is queen to g5. Now, more or less, white's threat in this position, if we put the queen back on f4, is rook f1. Black's got to do something against that move. He can't wait. So he's either got to play this e5 idea or queen to g5. And that stops rook f1 because of the threat of bishop h3. So in this position, white normally plays king h1. And now I recommend the move bishop to g4. The reason I'm recommending this line is that the natural move in this position is not good. The natural move, of course, is rook f1, to my eye. But I think then bishop e2 is a good move. Now if the rook moves up off the back rank, black's queen comes down to c1, for instance. Bang. If the rook goes to e1, then black can play queen to g4. And this is a strong idea, threatening both bishop to f3 with pressure and rook f8. It's not incidental that black also takes away the move e5 from white. So in this position h3 has been played, and then queen h5, e5, bishop to f3, with perhaps a slight edge to black. Returning to the position after knight h5, we see that white is not compelled to capture on e5. Indeed, he might try the move f5, which I personally think is more dangerous to black than the move f takes e5. Against this, I recommend knight to f4. And in most of the theory books, this is given just simply with compensation. They don't go any further. I'll go a little further. I'll say that white is almost compelled to take the knight on f4 in this position. Bishop takes f4. E takes f4. And now, with black poised to detonate the position with g takes f5, white again has to find the move knight e2, which a lot of your opponents might not do. And now I think the best move for black in this position is bishop to e5, with compensation. Black's bishop on e5 is a pillar of strength, and he threatens again the manoeuvre queen to d6, to f6, to h4, with attacking chances, as well as the immediate g takes f5, which would regain the pawn sacrificed. I think, all in all, after bishop e5, black's chances are satisfactory. Summarising, I know that e4 is one of white's main options, but I believe that after f4, black obtains interesting chances in virtually every single line. Certainly, if black is allowed to play g6, g5 and reinforce the pawn on f4, then he's in big business. Play after queen b3, white's other natural alternative on the 10th move, is not dissimilar to that which we've already looked at. I suppose you could say that the pawn on e2 gives white additional defensive chances around the king. The best move certainly after queen b3 is king to h8, because it makes sense to get the king off that vulnerable diagonal. And then two moves have been played for white, both of which give black chances. The first of these moves is bishop e3. Just a flexible development, intending perhaps to swing the rook from a1 across to either c1 or d1, depending on circumstances. I'm advocating that black simply get on with the kingside attack against these lines. And a good preparatory move is h6, intending g5. The game Magiramov-Avshalomov, USSR 1987, then continued. Rook a d1, g5, bishop c5, and the now familiar move a6, ruling out knight b5. White played e3, and now came knight to d7. Bishop went to a3, and black went e4. And now we see black's plan unravelling. I think he plans first of all to put the knight on e5, if allowed. That would be a very strong square, with twin entry points into the white position at d3 and f3. Add to this the ever-present threat of queen e8 to h5, and there you see the attack building. After knight d7 then, and e4, white played f3. I mean, he just didn't want that pawn on e4 to stay on the board any longer. But nevertheless, e takes f3, rook takes f3, knight e5, rook f1, queen went to e8, very familiar. White tried to shunt some pieces back to the defence with knight e2. Bishop d7 was played, threatening bishop a4 maybe. Queen went to c2, and now queen h5, with an easy to play attacking game for black. Back now to queen b3, king h8, and white's second option in this position is rook to d1. Again, a flexible move, maybe threatening to open up with c5 and d6, bringing white's pieces into the game. But I believe the best move in this position is a6, an idea of the inventive Russian grandmaster Mikhail Tsaitlin. And the idea is that black solidly defends the queen side, as happened for instance in the game Hardikse Mikhail Tsaitlin Budapest 1992, where c5 rook b8 was played, and then after having done that he gets on with his attack on the king side. For instance, a4 was played by Hardikse, and now comes h6, and with the idea of g5 followed by queen e8 followed by, for instance, just to show you a good attacking plan for black, queen h5, f4, bishop comes out to h3, and the knight comes into g4. That is essentially black's plan. You can play this type of position almost with your eyes shut. Summarising, I believe the main line with knight c6 is unjustly neglected these days. In fact, only a very few grandmasters play it. Having seen the analysis, and also having seen how, practically speaking, black can get such a good game with many chances, it's difficult to understand this unpopularity. White's plan after d5 is usually to play knight to d4, clamping black in the centre. But I believe, with accurate play, black can get a good game, a reasonable game, against this variation. Certainly the best move is knight bd7 here, and this is a direct attempt to take advantage of white's move order. It's also a useful move because if white plays knight c3 here, we can go knight e5, and hey presto, we're back in our main line. Let's imagine white goes knight d4, because that is the usual move here. Well, now the idea is to play knight to c5. And there are two possibilities for white in this position, but neither of these give any hope of a real advantage should black play aggressively. The ambitious move is b4, of course. And against this, I'm recommending the direct move e5. We'll follow the game Golubev versus Bailin, USSR 1955, where white played a more or less forced move here, d takes e6. Knight takes e6 was played, and white played bishop b2. Now this might look very logical from white's point of view, but the fact is that white is rather loose here. These pawns are a little bit loose. Bailin went for the throat on the king side. He played f4, and this set a little trap. White got carried away and played bishop takes b7, but this didn't turn out very well. For instance, now bishop takes b7 exclamation mark, knight takes e6, and now queen to d7 was the idea. Obviously if knight takes f8 now, then queen h3 is exceptionally strong, threatening checkmate, and if f3, then I think knight to g4 wins on the spot. So that's pretty cute. And in the game, knight takes f4 wasn't much better either. After g5, knight to d3, queen h3. Well, I think black also wins in the same way. The last word's yet to be said, obviously, in this position, because white's not forced to fall into that trap. But on the other hand, black is working up some chances on the king side, and I believe that black is at least equal here. Back to the position now after knight c5, and a far saner way for white to treat this position is simply to play knight c3. Whereupon black should certainly play a5, reinforcing the position of the knight on c5. It's similar to a King's Indian motif in many ways. This is a very strong piece, so black takes measures to cement the piece on the right square. And now I think black's looking for that right moment to play e5. This is definitely got to be in his mind here. Okay, white normally plays b3 in this position, and now this is the right moment. e5. Well, we'll assume that white can't leave the pawn structure as it is, and so he would take on e6. D takes e6. And now the key move here is c6. At a stroke, black blocks the diagonal of the bishop on g2 and threatens to recapture the pawn on e6. He could even delay the recapture one further move, putting his queen on e7. This is a very good plan for black in this variation. So I think you can rely, after d5, on the move knight bd7. It's the reason why most grandmasters have given up this line for white. Black simply gets adequate play after knight c5 and a5. Now what happens if, when your opponents are faced with an aggressive opening like the Lenningrad Dutch, they completely refuse to come out and fight? And I'm talking specifically about the insidious double fianchetto variation, where white makes no attempt whatsoever to take black on in the opening, but just quietly fianchettos both bishops, hoping to sap black's energy as the game goes on. In fact, this is an approach which has found considerable favour recently at grandmaster level, and you have to know how to play against such an approach by white. Well, I'm going to show you a good approach by black, an idea of Norwegian grandmaster Simen Agdenstein. And we're going to follow his game against Igor Stoll, grandmaster, from the Manila Interzonal 1990. Obviously there are various move orders by which white can achieve his goal. Stoll actually kicked off with one c4 and black played f5, and then he reached a double fianchetto position. More or less black can play the same way, whichever plan white adopts, because white's playing so slowly. So just the normal moves to reach the Leningrad position. Now white plays b3, bishop g7, bishop b2, d6, and now as soon as white saw that black was going to play e5, he played d4 himself. Fair enough, preventing black from playing e5. Black castled, bishop g2, and this is precisely the type of position I was alluding to earlier. Well, if you proceed with your mainline plan, a move like knight c6, that is playable. And in fact there was a recent article in a New in Chess yearbook by Grandmaster Stefan Kinderman when he recommended that black play something like this. Just the knight out to c6, the other knight into e4, and then e5. The problem with this approach was he felt that in this type of position white would simply exchange on e5, exchange on d8 and drain all the life out of the game. So in fact black's winning chances are zilch in this position, although he's got good chances of equalising. Agdenstein's approach is much more combative, and this is why I'm going to recommend it to you. Agdenstein's plan kicks off with the move c6. Now the idea of this is to get in e5 as quickly as possible, but this time black is finding a different route. White castles, and now queen to c7. Well, already you can see black planning the idea e7, e5. It's not possible just yet, but black only needs to make one more preparatory move for the idea to come fully into effect. Well, Stoll played knight bd2. If he'd played knight c3, I don't see much wrong with going straight through with e5, as indeed you can do against most other moves which take the pressure off the e5 square. But knight bd2 is a typical idea in the double fianchetto. It's this kind of negative approach, just waiting, slowly strengthening the position. And now a key idea. Knight g4. This is a very important component in black's plan. The knight move enforces the e7 to e5 advance. Well, Stoll saw that by passive play he could no longer delay black from playing e5, so he decided to hit out himself with e4. And Agderstein just went by f4. And now you can see the typical attacking chances building against white's king. Probably white's best move is h3 here. I think black is happy after knight h6. He's getting the move e5 in with typical chances against white's kingside. But in the game, white played queen c2, which although it looks natural is probably slightly inaccurate, because after f takes g3, h takes g3. Of course, if f takes g3, then knight e3 would win the exchange. White found that he couldn't actually dislodge black's knight from g4 very easily, and so this knight is actually on a wonderful square here, very close to the white king. Play went on, e5, the critical advance again, and black was comfortable. The Carlsbad variation is one of white's major tries against the Leningrad Dutch. It differs from the main lines in that white develops his king's knight to h3 rather than f3. The opening moves are the same as before. White would play g3 here, knight f6, bishop g2, g6, and now knight to h3. There are two main ideas behind this move. Firstly, the diagonal of the bishop is kept open, which might give white additional possibilities as the game goes on. And secondly, white is anticipating that black will play d6 when the knight comes to a very effective square on f4, and then white plays d5, clamping down on the e6 square. So it's a very positional idea, knight h3, and black's got to be on the ball to deflect it. Now the system I'm going to recommend to you is rather unusual. It involves the move e6 before d6. The main idea from black's point of view is that you don't want to be cramped with d5. I think that's a rather annoying move. I don't want that pawn on d5 very easily. So I'm prepared to stop it. And later on, building up with bishop g7 and queen e7, I can hope to play e5 at the right moment. It's worth it just to get e5 in and maybe even consign white's knight to the edge of the board forever. So that's the way I see this variation going, and let's see how the theory goes from this position. Well, black plays bishop g7, and then the main line is c4, castles, knight to c3. And here's the first position where I'm going to recommend e6 as being worthy of attention. Right, now as I say, the idea, if left undisturbed, is to go d6, queen e7, maybe c6, that's a nice careful move protecting the d5 square against an intrusion by white's knight, and then e5. That's the overall plan. If we can achieve that, we'll get some chances. So that's black's overall plan, and that's what white is looking to frustrate. In the game Lautier-Mikhail Gurevich, Munich 1993, white played b3. And that's kind of anticipatory, because maybe white's bishop is going to come out to a3. For instance, if you can imagine this position. And black's going to find it difficult to play e5. So that's White's idea. Accordingly, Gurevich played d6, castles, and not queen e7, but c6 first. And White played queen c2. And now there are two approaches for Black, both of which I consider to be satisfactory for him. In the game Lautier-Gurevich, Black played the immediate e5. I mean, obviously that's the most direct way. And after d takes e5, bishop a3, I think this is what Lautier was trying to achieve, rook e8, rook a d1, knight bd7, Lautier went bishop d6, after which Gurevich recommends e4. Unclear. Well, I don't know what to say about this position apart from the assessment is correct. I presume Black's plan is something like knight g4 followed by queen f6 and with pressure along the diagonal or occupation of the e5 square. That's one way for Black to play. An older game, Averbach-Gulko, USSR 1976, saw Black adopting a more cagey strategy, with Gulko playing a5 in this position. The idea was that when White's bishop went to a3, as indeed it did, Black would play knight a6, and then he could always think about blocking the bishop out with knight to b4. Averbach-Gulko continued, rook a d1, queen c7, knight f4, knight b4, queen b1, and then e5. I reckon this is quite a reliable method for Black. It's your choice. Going back to the position after Black plays bishop g7, White sometimes tries to do without the move c2, c4, playing knight to f4 immediately. And against this, I'm going to recommend the same type of idea, that is, the move e6 here, before d6. Basically, this gives White no time to implement his plan of d4 to d5. As soon as White goes on with that, Black is ready with e6 to e5. I find it quite surprising that e6 has only been played very rarely in this position. It seems to me to be one of the most logical moves available. Presumably, Black is just going to play the same way. d6, queen e7, c6, and then here, e5. That is Black's plan, more or less. In fact, I can only find one reference. That is the game Levin versus Shabalov, Leningrad 1989, where White played c3 here. Black played c6, knight went to d2, and Black played d6. And now seeing e5 coming up, White played knight to d3. Well, queen c7 was played. White played e4. That's the type of thing he's trying to do in the Dutch. And Black played e5. So it's a question of how you view this position. Personally, with Black having fully caught up with development, I view it as quite good for Black. Let's give a few more moves. White played d takes e5, hoping to saddle Black with hanging pawns. D takes e5, and then e takes f5. But Black was having none of those hanging pawns and played bishop takes f5, relying on active pieces and a lead in development to compensate for his weak e-pawn. A rather unusual position was reached after knight c5, knight bd7, knight c to e4, castles long. Not often you see Black doing that in the Lenningrad Dutch. Castle short, and then Black played h5. I view this as an imaginative and interesting way to play this variation. Summarising, I can understand why strong White players find this variation attractive, but I feel that if Black adopts the Christmas tree formation, you can see that triangle of pawns, and aims for the move e5 consistently with d6, c6 and queen e7 if he's left undisturbed, then he can count on a good game, and maybe even blot white's knight on h3 out of play. Now lots of black players are annoyed in this position when white doesn't play c4, but instead plays the reinforcing move c2 to c3. That looks like a passive move, but I wouldn't be fooled if I were you. White is threatening pressure with queen b3 along the light squares leading down to g8, and black could get easily into trouble if he doesn't know what he's doing. Against this setup, I recommend bishop g7, queen b3, knight c6, and this is the starting point for our investigation. White has played two moves in this position, knight f3 and knight h3. They are the critical ideas. Let's have a look at knight f3 first. Well, against this I recommend the move e6. I think that's a must when white plays queen b3. Firstly, and most obviously, it allows black to castle. Secondly, long term, black is looking forward, I think, to playing either e5, or in certain circumstances he may set up a kind of semi-stone wall formation with d5, which allows the knight to hop in to that nice square. And then white's queenside formation starts to look a bit silly. I mean, the pawn on c3, what's it doing there, the queen on b3? Not very much for white. So those are black's plans. Let's have a look at a snapshot from the game Salbossi versus Ochoa, Clichy Team Championship 1997. Black played e6, white castled, black castled, and white played knight bd2. And now came a5, hoping to push the white queen away off the diagonal. White played a4, and now black played d5, securing his centre against the possible advance e4. Now white went knight e1, e5, and after d takes e5, knight takes e5, black was massing his pieces on the king side for an attack. A better move for white in this position, I believe, is knight to h3. And it's this move that is currently giving black a bit of a problem. I'll show you what I believe are the best ways for black to meet this knight move. We'll kick off with e6. And now white has a few options which all have to be looked at. The first of these is bishop to g5. The idea of this is to develop the bishop actively before playing knight f4, with the traditional bind on the centre. I think it's very important for black to get out of the pin as quickly as possible in this position. And so I recommend d6, knight f4, and now queen d7, a recommendation of Stefan Pedersen. He gives the following analysis. Knight d2 here, knight d8, rook d1, c6, and both sides castle, with what he says is an equal position. As far as I can see, black's plan once again should be to aim for the advance e5 as quickly as possible. In this position he can do this by playing king h8, queen c7, and then e5, after which he'll get his usual chances. Another more aggressive possibility for white is the immediate knight f4. This doesn't look so aggressive until you see that the idea is that after black castles, white plays h4, a rather caveman-like assault on the black king. However, black should be able to survive with accurate play, and in Varga Milaniuk, Budapest 1989, he did just that. Black played queen e8 in this position. We'll see why this is useful in a few moves' time. Obviously it's going to be useful in the sense that long term black wants to play e5. That's not realisable just yet, of course, but it may be as the game continues. That's one point of queen e8. The other point is, of course, that after white plays h5, black plays g5 and white plays h6, the black can go bishop h8, and now the white knight can't slip into h5. Accordingly, in Varga-Milaniuk, white played knight d3, and the game got very murky indeed. Black played knight e4, and now white lashed out with g4. This doesn't look as though it can possibly be dangerous, does it? I mean, black is quite well developed here, but actually white is making very specific moves in this position. He threatens to win material with g takes f5. Well, black went d5, and after g takes f5, played knight to a5. White went queen b4, and there was a single repetition of moves. But anyway, queen c2 was played. But after e takes f5, surely black is not worse here. As the game went on, he was forced to sacrifice a pawn, but he managed to get all his pieces into interesting positions. Let's see it. White played rook g1, bishop f6, and now f3. Knight went back to d6, and now white played f4, opening up an attack against d5. Well, this is the pawn sacrifice now by black. Obviously it's a sacrifice that's been forced upon him, but shouldn't be too bad. Black went g4, bishop takes d5 check, bishop e6, bishop g2, and now c6. I mean, actually white's light squares in the centre don't look too hot to me. The e4, d5, c4 triangle, well, that looks quite juicy for black, especially if he elects to maybe offer the exchange of light square bishops. And also this pawn on h6 is not so strong. If black manages to round up the pawn, then, you know, he's got his pawn back and he's got two passed pawns on the king side. Also, there's a traffic jam of pieces on the queen side for white. So all in all, I believe that black has adequate compensation for the pawn. But tread warily in this line. Back to the position after black plays e6 now. And the final white move worth considering here is knight to d2. Against this, I feel black should play normally with d6. And two moves have been played for white. I'm going to keep my recommendations brief. I'll try and give you the best possibilities for black. White could be very direct and play e4 in this position. Against this, I recommend f takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, d5, an important preparatory move, bishop g2, and then e5. I think this is the best way for black to proceed. White can't take on d5 because his knight on h3 drops off. Black's plan, if left undisturbed, is maybe queen to d6 and then some sort of taking on h3 maybe, followed by castles on the king side. This seems to be quite reasonable for him. Finally in this section, a fragment from the game Sosonko versus Van Hester, the Netherlands, 1986, where after knight d2, d6, knight f4, black played queen to e7. Well, in view of this e5 idea, Sosonko lashed out with knight takes e6. Not a bad move, of course, because white is regaining the piece after bishop takes e6, queen takes b7, and after queen takes e6, white goes d5. But still, Van Hester played knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, queen e7. It's not a position where white can claim very much, I'm afraid. Black's plan is to go knight to d8 and then c6. If black gets these moves in, the bishop must retreat, and then black can just bishop e6 the white queen. White saw all this coming up and played queen to b5, but after queen d7, e4, knight e5, black had solved all his problems and had equality at least. We close the video by examining some irregular systems, or less played systems let's say, by which white hopes to frustrate black in his desire to play the Leningrad Dutch. In most cases, black can adopt the Leningrad formation, but there's one particular case that I'm thinking of where he shouldn't do so. And that is in the variation after knight f3, knight f6, bishop to g5. In this position, I think it's fairly unwise to play g6, because white would simply play bishop takes f6, e takes f6, and this is not a particularly promising formation for black. Accordingly, I'm going to recommend a different system against bishop g5, but one which equalises very comfortably. Perhaps black's safest move in this position is e6, and now white normally plays knight bd2. Bishop e7 will be my move, and the idea of white's system is to take on f6 here, bishop takes f6, and go e4. Okay, well, I believe there's nothing black can do about this system. You know, you've got to play as simply as possible against it, and the best way to equalise is to take on e4 in this position. So f takes e4. And in the game Schultz versus Bischoff, German Championship 1995, black quickly gained equality after knight takes e4, knight c6, c3, b6, bishop d3, bishop b7, queen c2, queen e7, and both sides castled on the queen side. You won't have to face this solid variation very often, but when you do, I recommend that you adopt this plan, just fianchetting the queen's bishop and castling on the queen side. It's a very solid response and gives black a perfectly respectable position. Another slightly awkward system to meet was seen in the game Gausel versus Stefan Pedersen, Gausel 1994, where white played 2c4, knight f6, knight c3, and now a lot of Leningrad players would just go g6 without thinking. Well, I believe that this allows white a dangerous attack after h4, and this is very much an attack I don't want to face. Accordingly, after 3 knight c3, I recommend, as Pedersen does in his excellent book Winning with the Dutch, the move d6. The idea is that should white play any other move apart from bishop g5, then black can go back into a Leningrad with g6 should he so desire, and if bishop g5 anyway, threatening to double black's pawns, then knight bd7 is a good move. We're more or less just waiting for white to reveal his hand, then we go back into the Leningrad setup. Now white can strike out on an independent course, but to do so is not really recommendable. For instance, in the game Anastasian versus Mikhail Gurevich, Russia 1988, white tried the bizarre move knight h3 in this position, whereupon e5 is a good move, keeping the knight out of the game. That game continued. e4, f takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop e7, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, bishop d3, castles, knight h to g5, knight takes e4, Knight takes e4, e takes d4, and white's aggressive and slightly bizarre play was beginning to rebound upon him. Black's a pawn up for nothing, as far as I can see. The game Gausel versus Pedersen continued. Queen c2, g6, e4. Perhaps this is the only move to put pressure on black. But after f takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop g7, black is in good shape. Occasionally you're going to come up against opponents who know nothing about the Leningrad Dutch at all and are just going to play what they feel like playing, some sort of solid setup for white, nothing incisive, but just playing chess. Such a system was seen in the game Sulava versus Milaniuk, Italy, 1995. Let's see the opening moves. d4, f5, knight f3, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and now e3. Okay, nothing special, but nothing wrong with it either. Black played d6, and now white slightly changed gear a bit, b4, which allowed black to immediately tactically attack white's position with c5, striking at the pawns before white's got a chance to support them with pieces. White played a3, castles by black, bishop b2, and now pointed development was the order of the day, and Milaniuk played knight to c6. Well, now b5 is completely essential for white. He has to push black's knight to the side and just play this position. I view this as comfortably equal for black. In the game, white made the mistake of playing d5, and black quickly built up an excellent position after c takes b4, knight b5, b takes a3, very good move this, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, d takes c6, queen a5 check, knight went to d2, and now black captured on a1. Queen took back on a1, and black played a2. Black obviously has an excellent position here. Well, I tried to start the tape with some inspirational games, and we're going to close with a very nice performance by Vladimir Kramnik as black in a Leningrad Dutch. This is against a Russian player called Tatayev, and it's one of his early games. It comes from the Belgorod tournament 1989, and it features one of those wishy-washy systems for white, and Kramnik just blows white away. It's very nice indeed. Let's take a look at it. White played g3, knight f6. These are all familiar moves. Bishop g2, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, both sides castle, and now any white worth his salt is going to play c4 here. Instead, white came out with knight bd2. Well, probably the best white can now achieve is some sort of double fianchetto with b3 and bishop b2. But white continues to play passive moves, and black quickly gets the upper hand. He played d6, and now comes c3. Well, already black can think about playing knight c6 and e5. Absolutely nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Against passive play, it may even be the best method. But Kramnik decided to play a prophylactic move. He saw white's queen possibly coming out to b3, and he played king to h8. If that was evasive, the next part of his plan is very direct. White went rook e1, knight c6, e4, e5. So here we are. As I've said before many times on this tape, once black gets a pawn on e5, as long as he's able to maintain that pawn, he gets great chances. D takes e5 was played, and black played d takes e5. White went queen b3, and then came a very familiar sacrifice to break open into white's kingside. f4 was played. G takes f4, and knight h5. So this is very similar to some variations we looked at earlier. Here, white's played c3 instead of c4. It shouldn't make much difference. Tataev tried to block lines with f5, but knight f4 was the reply, the key square. White's knight went back to f1, but Kramnik seized the opportunity to get rid of the important defensive piece on g2. Knight takes g2, king takes g2. Already white's game is a complete mess. Once that bishop goes, he really is under serious pressure. G takes f5, opening up the game for the bishop on c8. E takes f5, bishop takes f5. So white's passive play really has come to absolute zero. Black has drummed up the initiative almost as a matter of course. White played bishop to g5, still rather desperate move. Queen d7. Knight went back to g1. What a disgusting move that is. But he had to do something against the threat of bishop h3. And bishop came back to e6. Well, the position of that queen is very unpleasant. Meanwhile, black threatens to transfer his own queen to the king's side. Queen b5 was played. Bishop d5 check. f3. And now a beautiful finish. Rook takes f3. Knight takes f3. Queen g4 check, with mate now in 3 further moves. Knight g3. Queen takes f3 check. King h3. Bishop e6 check. King h4. Queen g4 checkmate. Proof positive that white cannot fiddle around against the Leningrad Dutch. I think you'll agree with me that the Leningrad Dutch is a fantastic winning attempt for black. But what of those anti-Dutch systems? What if white tries to slow black down? I can promise you some fascinating play and some real surprises on the anti-Dutch video.